The Guardian.
This Guardian podcast is supported by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that gives you the power of beautiful design. So you can do more than create a website, you can set yourself apart. To start your free trial, visit squarespace.com/guardian.
Hello and welcome to the Guardian Books podcast with me, Claire Armitstead. By the pricking of my thumbs, something spooky this way comes. As the nights draw in, we're snuggling down with some classic ghost stories. We join John Mullen at a Guardian Live event in London with a panel of writers interested in all things supernatural, scary and downright strange. Audrey Niffenegger, author of the international bestseller The Time Traveller's Wife, has published a collection, Ghostly, which brings together classic stories by Edgar Allan Poe and E.L. James, alongside new tales from Neil Gaiman and Kelly Link. Kim Newman is a connoisseur of horror, a novelist, film critic, and the author of the Anno Dracula series of novels which trace alternative histories in a world ruled by vampires. His most recent novel, conveniently, is called An English Ghost Story. The third member of our panel is Jeremy Dyson, a member of the League of Gentlemen and co-writer of the West End show Ghost Stories. He's the author of The Cranes That Built the Cranes, a collection of darkly comic and unsettling tales. Audrey Niffenegger begins by reading one of her favourite stories by Edwardian writer Saki, published in 1914 in his collection Beasts and Super Beasts. Saki, for those who don't already know, was the pen name of Hector Hugh Munro, whose witty, mischievous and sometimes macabre stories satirise Edwardian society and culture. Such is the wealth of his output that Niffenegger found herself spoilt for choice. But in the end, she went with this one, Laura.
"You are not really dying, are you?" asked Amanda. "I have the doctor's permission to live until Tuesday," said Laura. "But today is Saturday. This is serious," gasped Amanda. "I don't know about it being serious. It is certainly Saturday," said Laura. "Death is always serious," said Amanda. "I never said I was going to die. I am presumably going to leave off being Laura, but I shall go on being something. An animal of some kind, I suppose. You see, when one hasn't been very good in the life one has just lived, one reincarnates in some lower organism. And I haven't been very good, when one comes to think of it. I've been petty and mean and vindictive and all that sort of thing when circumstances have seemed to warrant it." "Circumstances never warrant that sort of thing," said Amanda hastily. "If you don't mind my saying so," observed Laura, "Egbert is a circumstance that would warrant any amount of that sort of thing. You're married to him. That's different. You're sworn to love, honor, and endure him. I haven't." "I don't see what's wrong with Egbert," protested Amanda. "Oh, I dare say the wrongness has been on my part," admitted Laura dispassionately. "He has merely been the extenuating circumstance. He made a thin, peevish kind of fuss, for instance, when I took the collie puppies from the farm out for a run the other day. They chased his young broods of speckled Sussex and drove 2 sitting hens off their nests, besides running all over the flower beds. You know how devoted he is to his poultry and garden. Anyway, he needn't have gone out about it for the entire evening and then have said, 'Let's say no more about it,' just when I was beginning to enjoy the discussion. That's when one of my petty vindictive revenges came in," added Laura, with an unrepentant chuckle. "I turned the entire family of speckled Sussex into his seedling shed the day after the puppy episode." "How could you?" exclaimed Amanda. "It came quite easy," said Laura. 2 of the hens pretended to be laying at the time, but I was firm. "And we thought it was an accident." "You see," resumed Laura, "I really have some grounds for supposing that my next incarnation will be in a lower organism. I shall be an animal of some kind. On the other hand, I haven't been a bad sort in my way, so I think I may count on being a nice animal, something elegant and lively, with a love of fun. An otter, perhaps." "I can't imagine you as an otter," said Amanda. "Well, I don't suppose you can imagine me as an angel, if it comes to that," said Laura. Amanda was silent. She couldn't. "Personally, I think an otter life would be rather enjoyable," continued Laura. "Salmon to eat all the year round, and the satisfaction of being able to fetch the trout in their own homes without having to wait for hours till they condescend to rise to the fly you've been dangling before them. And an elegant, svelte figure. Think of the otter hounds, interposed Amanda. How dreadful to be hunted and harried and finally worried to death. Rather fun with half the neighborhood looking on, and anyway, not worse than this Saturday to Tuesday business of dying by inches, and then I should go on into being something else. If I had been a moderately good otter, I suppose I should get back into human shape of some sort, possibly something rather primitive. A little brown, unclothed Nubian boy, I should think. I wish you would be serious, sighed Amanda. You really ought to be if you're only going to live till Tuesday. As a matter of fact, Laura died on Monday. So dreadfully upsetting, Amanda complained to her uncle-in-law, Sir Lulworth Quain. I've asked quite a lot of people down for golf and fishing, and the rhododendrons are just looking their best. Laura was always inconsiderate, said Sir Lulworth. She was born during Good Week, with an ambassador staying in the house who hated babies. She had the maddest kind of ideas, said Amanda. Do you know if there was any insanity in her family? Insanity? No, I've never heard of any. Her father lives in West Kensington, but I believe he's sane on all other subjects. She had an idea she was going to be reincarnated as an otter, said Amanda. One meets with those ideas of reincarnation so frequently, even in the West, said Sir Lulworth, that one can hardly set them down as being mad. And Laura was such an unaccountable person in this life that I should not like to lay down definite rules as to what she might be doing in an after state. You think she might really have passed into some animal form? Asked Amanda. She was one of those who shape their opinions rather readily from the standpoint of those around them. Just then, Egbert entered the breakfast room, wearing an air of bereavement that Laura's demise would have been insufficient in itself to account for. 4 of my speckled Sussex have been killed, he exclaimed, the very 4 that were to go to the show on Friday. One of them was dragged away and eaten right in the middle of that new carnation bed that I've been to such trouble and expense over. My best flower bed and my best fowls singled out for destruction. It almost seems as if the brute that did the deed had special knowledge how to be as devastating as possible in a short space of time. Was it a fox, do you think? Asked Amanda. Sounds more like a polecat, said Sir Lulworth. No, said Egbert. There were marks of webbed feet all over the place, and we followed the tracks down to the stream at the bottom of the garden. Evidently, an otter. Amanda looked quickly and furtively across at Sir Lulworth. Egbert was too agitated to eat any breakfast and went out to superintend the strengthening of the poultry yard defenses. I think she might at least have waited until the funeral was over, said Amanda in a scandalized voice. It's her own funeral, you know, said Sir Lulworth. It's a nice point in etiquette how far one ought to show respect to one's own mortal remains. Disregard for mortuary convention was carried to further lengths next day. During the absence of the family at the funeral ceremony, the remaining survivors of the speckled Sussex were massacred. The marauders' line of retreat seemed to have embraced most of the flower beds on the lawn, but the strawberry beds in the lower garden had also suffered. I shall get the otter hounds to come here at the earliest possible moment, said Egbert savagely. On no account, you can't dream of such a thing, exclaimed Amanda. I mean, it wouldn't do so soon after a funeral in the house. It's a case of necessity, said Egbert. Once an otter takes to that sort of thing, it won't stop. Perhaps it will go elsewhere now that there are no more fowls left, suggested Amanda. One would think you wanted to shield the beast, said Egbert. There's been so little water in the stream lately, objected Amanda. It hardly seems sporting to hunt an animal when it has so little chance of taking refuge anywhere. Good gracious, fumed Egbert. I'm not thinking about sport. I want to have the animal killed as soon as possible. Even Amanda's opposition weakened when, during church time on the following Sunday, the otter made its way into the house, raided half a salmon from the larder, and worried into scaly fragments on the Persian rug in Egbert's studio. We shall have it in hiding under our bed and biting pieces out of our feet before long, said Egbert, and from what Amanda knew of this particular otter, she felt that the possibility was not a remote one. On the evening preceding the day fixed for the hunt, Amanda spent a solitary hour walking by the banks of the stream, making what she imagined to be hound noises. It was charitably supposed by those who overheard her performance that she was practicing for farmyard imitations at the forthcoming village entertainment. It was her friend and neighbor, Aurora Burrett, who brought her news of the day's sport. Pity you weren't out. We had quite a good day. We found it at once, in the pool just below your garden. Did you kill? Asked Amanda. Rather. A fine she-otter. Your husband got rather badly bitten in trying to tail it. Poor beast, I felt quite sorry for it. It had such a human look in its eyes when it was killed. You'd call me silly, but do you know who the look reminded me of? My dear woman, what is the matter? When Amanda had recovered to a certain extent from her attack of nervous prostration, Egbert took her to the Nile Valley to recuperate. Change of scene speedily brought about the desired recovery of health and mental balance. The escapades of an adventurous otter in search of a variation of diet were viewed in their proper light. Amanda's normally placid temperament reasserted itself. Even a hurricane of shouted curses coming from her husband's dressing room in her husband's voice, but hardly in his usual vocabulary, failed to disturb her serenity as she made a leisurely toilette one evening in a Cairo hotel. "What is the matter? What has happened?" she asked in amused curiosity. "The little beast has thrown all my clean shirts into the bath. Wait till I catch you, you little..." "What little beast?" asked Amanda, suppressing a desire to laugh. Egbert's language was so hopelessly inadequate to express his outraged feelings. "A little naked beast of a naked brown Nubian boy," sputtered Egbert. And now Amanda is seriously ill.
So why did you choose that one, Audrey?
I think because of the relentless politeness of it all. Laura is such a great character because she is so completely immune to anybody else's feelings or desires, and is prepared to pursue all her dislikes and amusements into several succeeding lives. And so there's a nice contrast between her manners and her relentlessness.
And I mean, it's quite unlike lots of ghost stories, and perhaps unlike what some people would imagine ghost stories are supposed to be like, in that it's not frightening. It's not at all scary, or is it? I mean, it strikes me as not scary. It's very amusing.
There's actually a lot of stories in the collection which are not even slightly scary, and they're not trying to scare you, but if you really stopped and imagined it happening to you, it would be kind of weird.
And it also has that thing, that peculiarity of it, the friend, Amanda. Usually in a ghost story, I always kind of ticking off, when I was reading some of the other stories in your collection, ticking off some of the sort of conventions you get in ghost stories. And one of the key ones, which I think, Jeremy, is written into your ghost stories play, about which we're allowed to do endless puffing but not actually say anything specific because it would spoil it. But I believe that is introduced, has a character who's very sceptical about... And one of the peculiarities of lots of ghost stories is there's often a skeptic in it. There's often somebody whose disbelief has to be overwhelmed, and sometimes that person's the very narrator of the story. Mm-hmm. But in the one that you read, Audrey, the friend instantly believes that this has happened, doesn't she? So I mean, it's quite sort of peculiarly not like.
Yeah, Amanda is easily led, but what's so nice is just that everybody is so much themselves, and they're really not too worried about what anybody else might think. I mean, the skeptic character, I don't know if you'll agree, but the skeptic character is usually a stand-in for the reader, and the writer is overcoming the reader's resistance as well as that character's resistance.
Yeah. I mean, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, you say it's not scary, but it is uneasy.
Yeah.
And there's an uneasiness that's common across Saki stories, in that there's a very strange thing happening with no explanation, and everyone's just accepting it.
Yeah.
And the other source of the uneasiness is Laura's jolliness in the face of death, which is, goes without comment, and yet strikes everyone at the heart, because nobody's that comfortable with the notion of their own death, unless you're even the arch believer, I think.
Well, all the characters, they get fussed at very small things, and they're very nonchalant about the big things.
Yes. And that sort of savagery set in, I don't, does it say where it is, but you sort of imagine it's sort of Sussex or something, don't you? I mean, that's a kind of Saki thing as well, isn't it? That in the most domesticated and tame circumstances, there's some sort of flicker of savagery or bestiality or something. Kim, are you a Saki fan?
Yes, I am very much. I actually do think he's quite, maybe not scary, but quite frightening. The whole idea of this world is terrifying. Yeah. Because it's savage.
Yeah.
It's savage and it's cruel, even though superficially well-mannered. The other story you mentioned, The Open Window, turns brilliantly on on just random cruelty. And so many of his stories are about people who just decide to do something horrid and get away with it, usually. And we are asked not to admire them, but to accept them. They're there. Yeah, they do this stuff. So I think there's a genuine whiff of terror.
Very good at skewering the hypocrisy of that society and that culture, and obviously took great delight in it and doing it and pricking it in quite demonic ways, really. And there's a challenge in all of those stories that's unsettling.
I think he's kind of like P.G. Wodehouse and Ramsey Campbell thrown together.
Yeah. I also have a P.G. Wodehouse story in this collection called Honeysuckle Cottage, which is about the horrifying effects of sentimentality. This writer is being terrorized by his romance-writing, potboiler-producing aunt who wills him a lovely pink cottage, which just drives him to the edge of madness.
Maybe that's what the English are really terrified of.
My favourite line in the story you've read is the bit where, Amanda, who we do sort of see towards the end, trying to sort of scare the otter away, but just before that, when the otter rips up a salmon, is it actually on the carpet? And it says something like, even Amanda's opposition weakened. And that sort of sense that kind of... malice, which is often the property of ghosts in ghost stories, is actually given to the human beings, isn't it? Albeit a malice of a very ordinary kind.
And you're on the ghost side, aren't you?
Yeah, malice beyond death is usually... there are some ghosts in ghost stories who are pathetic rather than terrifying, but they're there to remind us how awful things are.
And as a reminder of just how awful things can be, we move from the uneasy to the utterly inexplicable. Kim Newman's choice is an excerpt from The Thing Invisible, written by another star of the late Victorian and Edwardian era, William Hope Hodgson. It's one of the Carnacki stories, featuring a pre-Sherlockian occult detective. It starts, as so many spooky tales do, by the fireside.
Dinner over, Carnacki snugged himself down into his great chair, as I've said was his habit, filled his pipe and puffed for a while, his gaze directed thoughtfully at the fire. The rest of us, if I may express it, made ourselves cosy, each after his own particular manner. A minute or so later, Carnacki began to speak, ignoring any preliminary remarks and going straight to the subject of the story we knew he had to tell. I've just come back from Sir Alfred Jarnock's place in Burton Tree in South Kent, he began, without removing his gaze from the fire. Most extraordinary things have been happening down there lately, and Mr. George Jarnock, the eldest son, wired to ask me to run over and see whether I could help clear matters up a bit. I went. When I got there, I found that they have an old chapel attached to the castle, which has had quite a distinguished reputation for being what is popularly termed haunted. They've been rather proud of this, as I managed to discover, until quite lately when something very disagreeable occurred, which served to remind them that family ghosts are not always content, as I might say, to remain purely ornamental. It sounds almost laughable, I know, to hear of a long-respected supernatural phenomenon growing unexpectedly dangerous. And in this case, the tale of the haunting was considered as little more than an old myth, except after nightfall, when possibly it became more plausible seeming. But however this may be, there is no doubt at all but that what I might term the haunting essence which lived in the place had become suddenly dangerous. Deadly dangerous, too, the old butler being nearly stabbed to death one night in the chapel with a peculiar old dagger. It is in fact this dagger which is popularly supposed to haunt the chapel. At least there's always been a story handed down in the family that this dagger would attack any enemy who should dare to venture into the chapel after nightfall. But, of course, this had been taken with just about the same amount of seriousness that people take most ghost tales, and it is not usually of a worryingly real nature. I mean that most people never quite know how much or how little they believe of matters abhuman or abnormal, and generally they never have an opportunity to learn. And, indeed, as you are all well aware, I am as big a skeptic concerning the truth of ghost tales as any man you're likely to meet. Only I am what I might term an unprejudiced skeptic. I'm not given to either believing or disbelieving things on principle, as I've found many idiots prone to be, and what is more, some of them not ashamed to boast of the insane fact. I view all reported hauntings as unproven until I have examined them, and I'm bound to admit that 99 cases in 100 turn out to be sheer bosh and fancy. But the 100th, well, if it were not for the 100th, I should have few stories to tell you, eh? Of course, after the attack on the butler, it became evident that there was at least something in the old story concerning the dagger, and I found everyone in a half-belief that the queer old weapon really did strike the butler, either by aid of some inherent force, which I found them peculiarly unable to explain, or else in the hand of some invisible thing or monster of the outer world. From considerable experience, I knew that it was much more likely that the butler had been knifed by some vicious and quite material human. Naturally, the first thing to do was to test this probability of human agency, and I set to work to make a pretty drastic examination of the people who knew most about the tragedy. The result of this examination both pleased and surprised me, for it left me with the very good reasons for belief that I had come upon one of those extraordinary, rare, true manifestations of the extrusion of a force from the outside. In more popular phraseology, a genuine case of haunting. And there's a load more mystery to come before you find out.
Are we allowed
who
to?
stabbed the butler?
Are we allowed to give away the?
Unlike most people who've done like psychic detective type stories, Hodgson throws a couple of Scooby-Doo stories in there.
Yeah.
So once it turns out to be IRA gun smugglers in the basement, and once there's some other completely natural explanation for the haunting, but in this one, it really is the thing invisible is out to get them. The one that most people remember is the one about the hog, the evil pig from out which is on the cover.
Yeah, so Karnacki
Yep.
stories, and his investigations are new to me, I confess. Yeah. And so they're a mixture of the natural and the supernatural.
He is a supernatural detective,
Yeah.
which is why he's got this. There's a sort of kind of shop talk, and he uses some of the H.P. Lovecraft was rather sniffily dismissed Karnacki by saying it had the whiff of professional occultism about it. But I kind of like professional occultism, and the setup you get there is very comforting, because you know he survived because he's telling you the story, and he's there with all his friends, and they've had the brandy and the cigars and the good meal, and he's yarning about it. What Hodgson does brilliantly is then makes it frightening, because Karnacki, although he believes in all this stuff, he knows what's going on, and he intends to do something about it, but he is still frightened when the bad stuff starts happening. I think this was the first of the stories, so it's the template for the rest of them. And there's only this one book. There's only a handful of stories.
I mean, it's funny what you say. You know that he's survived, because, again, what I'm more used to from ghost stories, and what I found a little bit, I think I'd have to get used to it. I'd have to read some more. Is the fact that he is a bit like Sherlock Holmes, quite imperturbable, and you think whether it's supernatural or not, he's going to cope with it very well. And indeed, he dons suits of armor and does all sorts of things. He can do photography. He's got a gun. And,
you know that bit in The Devil Rides Out with the where they hide in the circle, and Christopher Lee reads the Samar ritual? That's stolen from a Karnacki story.
Is it?
The Samar ritual was invented by William Hope Hodgson, and Dennis Wheatley lifted it.
What I want in the ghost story, I suppose, what I've got used to is when you have this wonderful thing which you've described, is often so important, that the story starts with somebody telling a story about meeting somebody with a story. And often the person with the story, the person who's got access to the actual ghost story, has been permanently disturbed, scarred. You know, you can see that. I mean, when you go through, I don't know, Susan Hill, the woman in black, she's read all those stories. She knows what you've got to do. And there's somebody who in middle age is still traumatized and tells it.
One of the things about William Hodgson, actually, like Saki, died in World War One, and had had a very complicated and not exactly happy life beforehand. And there is a sense that Carnacki has actually been irreparably harmed by the cumulative effect of his career. And he's not quite the confident character he seems to be in the frame stories. When he's actually in the field, he does get terrified, and he does get very shaky. Hodgson spent a lot of time at sea, and he wrote several really great, terrifying seagoing ghost stories. And he was also one of the first people in Britain to practice bodybuilding. And it's really interesting for somebody who was interested in ghosts. He spent a lot of his time making himself physically fit and physically strong. But he wasn't particularly strong emotionally.
All of this begs a really interesting question, which is, what is the threat from a ghost?
Yeah.
Because, what harm can a ghost do us that we are so fearful of?
Yeah, well, it can tip your shirts in the bath, obviously. But it almost has to be, in order for a ghost story to be scary, there has to be a sense that they can hurt you. Yeah. And sometimes they can hurt you because you've done something wrong and they know it and will expose you. And sometimes they can actually genuinely physically hurt you. I mean, the idea that the spook could do. I mean, we all know those stories where the last paragraph finds the protagonist with his hair white, dead, and the doctor says, it's almost as if he died of sheer fright. And you think, well, yeah, and that's not quite as bad. Or sometimes you have the clutching marks of the skeleton hand.
I had a question. You said he died young in World War I. Do you feel like he wasn't quite done with Carnacki?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he probably would have written
because maybe he would have, wrecked him up a little bit more and killed him and whapped him around.
There is a sense that in just this one book, he does all the variations he could have, but he never wrote a novel about him, which he might have done more with.
This Guardian podcast is supported by Squarespace. If you want to build a website, you've got many options. But if you want to build it beautiful, there's only one. Squarespace gives you the power of world-class design so you can do more than create a website. You can set yourself apart. See why some of the world's most influential people, brands and businesses choose Squarespace. To start your free trial, head to squarespace.com/Guardian.
And finally, on to Jeremy Dyson, who is known for his dark and surreal work on The League of Gentlemen. He ascribes his desire to write to the influence of Ramsey Campbell, the only one of these featured short story authors who's still alive. He reads from the very beginning of The Show Goes On, set in a creepy cinema where all is not what or who it seems.
The nails were worse than rusty. They'd snapped. Under cover of several coats of paint, both the door and its frame had rotted. As Lee tugged at the door, it collapsed towards him with a sound like that of an old cork leaving a bottle. He hadn't used the storeroom since his father had nailed the door shut to keep the rats out of the shop. Both the shelves and the few items which had been left in the room, an open tin of paint, a broken neck brush, looked merged into a single mass composed of grime and dust. He was turning away, having vaguely noticed a dark patch that covered much of the dim wall at the back of the room, when he saw that it wasn't dampness. Beyond it, he could just make out rows of regular outlines like teeth in a gaping mouth. Seats in an old cinema. He hadn't thought of the cinema for years. Old resurrected films on television, shrunken and packaged and robbed of flavour, never reminded him. It wasn't only that Cagney and Bogart and the rest had been larger than life, huge hovering faces like ancient idols. The cinema itself had had a personality. The screen framed by twin theatre boxes from the days of the music hall, the faint smell and muttering of gaslights on the walls, the manager's wife and daughter serving in the auditorium and singing along with the musicals. In the years after the war, you could get in for an armful of lemonade bottles or a bag of vegetables if you owned one of the nearby allotments. There'd been a greengrocer's old weighing machine inside the pay box. These days, you had to go to watch films in concrete warrens if you could afford to go at all. Still, there was no point in reminiscing, for the old cinema was now a back entry for thieves. He was sure that was how they'd robbed the other shops on the block. At times, he thought he'd heard them in the cinema. They sounded too large for rats, and now, by the look of the wall, they made themselves a secret entrance to his shop. Mrs. Entwistle was waiting at the counter. These days she shopped here less from need than from loyalty, remembering when his mother had used to bake bread at home to sell in the shop. "Just a sliced loaf," she said apologetically. "Will you be going past Frank's yard?" Within its slippery wrapping, the loaf ready to deflate, not like his mother's bread at all. "Could you tell him that my wall needs repairing urgently? I can't leave the shop." Buses were carrying stragglers to work or to school. 90 minutes later, he could tell the time by the passengers, which meant he didn't have his watch repaired. The buses were ferrying shoppers down to Liverpool city centre, and Frank still hadn't come. Grumbling to himself, Lee closed the shop for 10 minutes. The February wind came slashing up the hill from the Mersey, trailing smoke like ghosts of the factory chimneys. Down the slope, a yellow machine clawed at the remains of houses. The liver buildings looked like a monument in a graveyard of concrete and stone. Beyond kiddie gear and the whole food shop, Frank's yard was a maze of new timber. Frank was feeding at the edge of a door to a shrieking circular blade. He gazed at Lee as though nobody had told him anything. When Lee kept his temper and explained, Frank said, "No problem, just give me a moan when you're ready." "I'm ready now." "Ah, well, as soon as I finish this job, I'll whiz round." Lee had reached the exit when Frank said, "I'll tell you something that'll amuse you." 15 minutes later, Lee arrived back, panting at his shop. It was intact. He hurried round the outside of the cinema, but all the doors seemed immovable and he couldn't find a secret entrance. Nevertheless, he was sure that the thieves, children probably, were sneaking in somehow. The buses were full of old people now, sitting stiffly as china. The lunchtime trade trickled into the shop, men who couldn't buy their brand of cigarettes in the pub across the road, children sent on errands while their lunches went cold or on tables or dried in ovens. An empty bus raced along the deserted street, and a scrawny youth in a leather jacket came into the shop while his companion loitered in the doorway. Would Lee have a chance to defend himself or at least to shout for help? But they weren't planning theft, only making sure they didn't miss a bus. Lee's heart felt both violent and fragile. Since the robberies had begun, he'd felt that way too often. The shop was still worth it. "Don't keep it up if you don't want to," his father had said, but it would have been admitting defeat to do anything else. Besides, he and his parents had been even closer here than at home. And since their death, he'd had to base his stock on items people wanted in a hurry or after the shops had closed. Flashlights, canned food, light bulbs, cigarettes. Lee's home-baked bread was a thing of the past, but it was still Lee's shop. Packs of buses climbed the hill, carrying home the rush-hour crowds. When a newspaper van dumped a stack of the evening's Liverpool Echo on the doorstep, he knew Frank wasn't coming. He stormed round to the yard, but it was locked and deserted. Well then, he would stay in the shop overnight. He'd nobody to go home for. Why, he'd even made the thieves' job easier by helping the door to collapse. The sight of him in the lighted shop ought to deter thieves. It better had, for their sakes. He bought 2 pork pies and some bottles of beer from the pub. Empty buses moved off from the stop like a series of cars on a fairground ride. He drank from his mother's coronation mug, which always stood by the electric kettle. He might as well have closed the shop at 8 o'clock. Apart from an old lady who didn't like his stock of cat food, nobody came. Eventually, he locked the door and sat reading the paper, which seemed almost to be written in a new language. "Head raps shock axe," said a headline about the sudden closing of a school. Should he prop the storeroom door in place lest he fall asleep? No. He ought to stay visible from the cinema in the hope of scaring off the thieves. In his childhood, they would hardly have dared sneak into the cinema, let alone steal. Not in the last days of the cinema when the old man had been roaming the aisles. Everybody, perhaps even the manager, had been scared of him. Nobody Lee knew had ever seen his face. You'd see him fumbling at the dim gaslights to turn them lower, and then he'd begin to make sounds in the dark, as though he was both muttering to himself and chewing something soft. He would creep up on talkative children and shine his flashlight into their eyes. And as he hissed at them, a pale substance would spill from his mouth.
That seems to me to have the opposite convention from the one that Kim's had, which is you know that the protagonist is in a ghost story, but he doesn't, as it were. Yes. I mean, that's quite a common thing, and quite often that it means that the protagonist starts as he does goes on to do in this story, investigating something, with the reader almost saying, no.
Yeah, I mean, it's got the classic elements, of a ghost story in that there's a big, lonely, empty building that's derelict. I did a few years ago. I was working on developing a TV anthology series of ghost stories that never happened, and I did a set of principles of picking all my favourite stories and what do they all have in common, and certainly being on your own was one, at least in the ones that I cherished. Being alone, being in an empty place, removed from other people. And it was many years later when me and Andy were researching Ghost Stories, the play, and the first thing we did was took Professor Richard Wiseman out for dinner, who was a friend of Andy's and is an expert on the paranormal from a psychological side of things. And he said you can explain the ghost response very, very simply in terms of evolutionary biology, which is that we've developed through evolution to, when we're on our own in a place where we're vulnerable, which read a dark, empty cave, we are likely to see faces in the dark. And because there's a huge evolutionary advantage in so doing, if you go into a dark place where you're vulnerable as a caveman and you think you see a saber-toothed tiger at the back, well, you run out to survive another day and propagate your genes. But the fascinating thing is, it doesn't matter whether you imagined it or whether it was actually there. Even if it was only there 1 in 10 times or 1 in 100 times, like his ghost stories, you are still predisposed through millions of years of evolution to be frightened when you're on your own, vulnerable in a lonely place. And that explains an awful lot of the feelings that you have when you read a ghost story or when you watch a scary film, or indeed have that feeling of your hackles rising when you're on your own in a dark and lonely place.
So what do you think, Audrey? Do you think that's the case? Do you think we're sort of somehow pre-programmed, even if we don't believe any of this stuff, somehow to sort of respond viscerally to that I remember the moment at which, for instance, I sort of passed into a state where I no longer thought that there was going to be something dark at the top of the stairs, in the dark, and yet still...
It comes back later.
Do you think it's some sort of inherent thing that we've got?
I'm from Chicago. It's very intelligent to be worried when you're in a dark, lonely place, and it's definitely a helpful emotion to be having. I mean, I think we're made to be at least somewhat cautious. I was reading something recently where somebody was doing this experiment with mice who had been bred to be fearless. These mice just didn't have any caution whatsoever. And the researchers were doing experiments to research the biome, all the bacteria that we run around with. So they took some very fearful mice and they gave bits of their bacteria to the fearless mice, and the fearless mice became very fearful indeed. So our bacteria are what's doing this to us, actually. Bacteria want to live another day.
There's a lot of research as well recently with psychopharmacology and neuroscience, which is, it used to be believed that fear was a learned response, and now it's thought completely differently, that it's completely biologically instantiated, and that actually the fear response is always on, always. But when we're not frightened, it's because the part of the brain called the hypothalamus is suppressing the fear, which it does when we're just like this. And if you say you're in bed at night, asleep, and you wake up with a start because there's been a loud noise from upstairs, that's the hypothalamus in action, because what it does is a mechanism kicks in where it's like, if you think it's got its foot on the hose all the time and fear's in the hose, if it senses the threat, it lifts the foot off the hose and on flows the fear. And it's so acute and so delicate that it will do that. I constantly waking up because the fridge is cracking, and I wake up like that.
But if there was a character in a ghost story who said what you've just said, he'd be doomed, wouldn't he? He'd be doomed to have an M.R. James demon descend on him and to recognise on the last page that actually his explanation was not enough.
And he'd probably be right to be doomed as well for his hubris.
I mean, maybe is it silly to ask before we throw it open? I mean, Audrey, do you believe in ghosts at all?
No.
No. So it's a complete sort of...
I am so not fun in that way.
Kim?
No.
No.
And the other thing is, for most of my life, I have lived in very old places. I grew up in a house actually rather like the one in English Ghost Story, which goes back to bits of it to the 15th century. Anybody know a TV play called The Exorcism by Don Taylor? You must know that, right?
Yes.
Me and my mum watched that when it went out, and it was the first time either of us had considered all the people who died in our house beforehand. And okay, the play terrified us, but it didn't change how we felt about the house. I now live in a flat in a converted police station in Islington, and I've looked up some of the horrible people who have been dragged through, who would have, the most miserable, vile, despicable people trooped in and out of this building for 150 years. Several famous murders were investigated out of it. I have never had so much as a twinge to the extent I'm a bit disappointed. And not only that, no one who's ever stayed there, as far as I know, has ever felt any sense of discomfort, despite the fact my house is filled with ghostly apparatus and scary books. And because when you do this kind of thing for a living, people give you little glow-in-the-dark tchotchkes, in the way that your grandmother had, saucers on a French dresser. I've got lots of little vampires and stuff, whatever, all those kind of things. And I also remember that Doctor Who serial from the early 70s in which the plastic things come to life and stuff. Nothing. So
now, if you were a character in one of my stories, we would be doing this, and then someone would come to stay with you next week, and they would give you a little box, and the little box would have a ghost in it.
True.
And it would prove everything that you just said. It would tear it apart.
Yeah.
Jeremy, you...
Same.
Yes.
Same with one qualification, which is I do go with Kafka when his brilliant phrase that, we're always going to come up against the bony limits of our own forehead. And you've got to have a bit of humility because we live in an age where there's an illusion that we know everything. We live in a ridiculously materialist culture, which is like, that much of the story.
Yeah. I didn't say I wasn't terrified. But I said I didn't believe in ghosts.
No, I don't believe in the ghost as in the what we've been talking about tonight. But I have experienced anomalies, which often come in the form of strange coincidences, and which we all have. That's common enough for Young to have written a book about it. But and that's when things don't add up to the post-Enlightenment thinking model of the world. So you got to.
I mean, what about? Can I just as a last thought to throw in then that given that we've got a row of non-believers, as it were. I mean, I too am a non-believer, but I have
I'll go with agnostic.
Okay, agnostic. But I remember, without getting too anecdotal, my mother believed in things. And she's dead now, but she definitely believed in things, and not very sort of hammer horror things, but she had a small fund of stories, which she told as true stories. And they made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because she believed them, because she absolutely believed them. And they often were puzzles rather than peculiar things, and they were all to do with places. And once or twice about things she had herself experienced in peculiar places where she discovered afterwards something bad had happened, that usual thing. And definitely there was so much force in it that if I tell to my own family, as I do sometimes, if I tell to my wife, who's an absolute Darwinian materialist, one of the stories my mum told me, she finds it really quite scary and upsetting because she knew my mother, and she knew my mother wouldn't have told the story if she didn't believe it. And even at one remove, that's quite a powerful thing. And I mean, I wonder if you've come across examples then of people who can convince because they're convinced as well, as it were.
Well, if you publish ghost stories, people will come to you with the most wonderful things that happened to them.
Right.
And they will tell them to you beautifully. And just for that moment, I will definitely believe them.
Jeremy Dyson there, bringing an end to our trio of resurrections from the history of the ghost story. Many thanks to him, to Audrey Niffenegger and Kim Newman. We'll be back next week with one of our occasional treats. Forest Fables, a series of short stories inspired by and recorded in the woodlands of England. They'll run daily from Tuesday to Friday with contributors including Alan Garner, Ali Smith, Evie Wilde and Alec Finley. Until then, from the corner of the Guardian podcast studio where I'm currently cowering with our producer Susanna Trezillian, goodbye and may your Halloween be haunting.